The day after my father's funeral, I walked into his workshop and found a locked metal box bolted to his workbench, something I had never seen in all my 58 years. And the moment I opened it, I understood that it had been hiding a truth capable of tearing apart everything I thought I knew about my family. Before we dive into the story, make sure you're following the channel and hit the bell icon, because I promise you every story here will pull you straight into the middle of someone's darkest truth. My name is Michael Turner. I'm 58 years old, and I honestly believe that once we buried my father, the worst part of that week was over. But when I stepped into his workshop that evening to clean up his things and maybe hold on to something familiar, I immediately realized something was wrong the moment my eyes landed on that black metal box bolted into his workbench, as if he was preparing for someone to come looking for it. The workshop had always been a place where I felt grounded, because every tool hung in the same place for decades. Every drawer still held the same mess of screws and old receipts, and every scratch on the wooden table carried a memory of some broken engine I helped him fix. Yet as soon as I stepped inside now, I felt that something was off, as if the room was waiting for me to notice what didn't belong there. The box was heavy and oddly clean, without a single layer of dust, which told me someone had touched it very recently, maybe even in the last days before he died. And the thick industrial bolts holding it down to the table made the whole thing feel less like storage and more like a warning. I leaned closer, trying to understand how something so strange could exist in a room I knew better than the living room of my own house. And for several long seconds, I just stared at the lock, because my father wasn't the kind of man who trusted locks or secrets, and seeing one here made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. I searched every drawer around the workshop, opening old boxes full of nails, moving aside stacks of sandpaper, lifting jars of washers and forgotten screws, yet there was nothing that looked like a key, which only made the tension in my chest build faster, because the fact that he hid the key meant he wanted this box to stay closed unless someone very specific opened it. Then I remembered the chain that slipped from his neck in the kitchen the morning he collapsed, the thin silver chain with 3 small keys attached that one of the paramedics accidentally kicked under the fridge while trying to revive him, and suddenly my heart started beating faster, because I realized I never checked his old toolbox, the one he almost never touched anymore. I pulled it out, dropped it on the table, and after digging through rusted pliers, old screwdrivers, and a crack tape measure, my fingers finally touched something cold and wrapped in black electrical tape, a small key with fresh scratches on its surface. And at that moment, I understood that this box wasn't an accident or a forgotten project, but something my father had prepared deliberately. Once I slid the key into the lock, I hesitated for a moment, because deep down, I already knew that whatever was inside that box would force me to see my father in a way I never had before. So when the lock clicked open with sharp metallic sound, it felt like the room itself shifted around me. Inside the box was a thick stack of envelopes tied with rubber band, each envelope labeled with a name written in my father's careful handwriting. Names I didn't recognize, names that didn't belong to any relative or family friend. And on top of all of them lay a single envelope with my name written in bold, underlined twice, as if he wanted to make sure I read it first. I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of it, and even before I opened it, I already knew that whatever he had left inside would not be something simple or harmless, because the man I buried yesterday was not the same man these envelopes hinted he had been. And when I finally tore it open and looked inside, the first photograph almost made me drop the entire box. I stood there holding that photograph, tried to understand how something so simple could make my entire body freeze. Because the man standing next to my father wasn't just a forgotten face from the past, but someone whose disappearance had been whispered about for decades, someone people mentioned only when they thought nobody was listening. And realizing that my father had been standing beside him willingly made me feel as if the floor under me had shifted in a way I couldn't steady myself against. I moved toward the workbench, set the photograph down, and leaned over it, studying every detail I could find, because the room they were in wasn't familiar, and the objects on the table, especially that black notebook filled with names I had seen inside the envelopes, suggested that whatever my father had been involved in stretched much further than a simple old business partnership gone wrong. And the worst part was that he looked calm, almost focused, as if he wasn't being forced into that photo, but was part of something he never told me about. The name written on the back of the photo made my throat tighten. Robert Hale, 1998, the year he disappeared, the year he supposedly fled the state, the year my father suddenly stopped talking about the past. I heard a creak behind me and turned sharply, not because I expected danger, but because the workshop suddenly felt like a place where secrets lived in the walls. And when my sister Anna stepped inside without knocking, the look on her face told me she'd been expecting me to find something, though she tried to hide it with the usual stiff expression she used at funerals and family arguments. She asked what I was doing out here, and I told her I was cleaning, but my voice didn't sound convincing even to myself. So when she noticed the box and the envelopes and finally the photograph on the table, her tense silence told me she understood that something serious was happening, something that didn't fit inside the normal grief of losing a parent. I handed her the photo without saying a word, letting her look at it as long as she needed, and I watched her eyes widen slowly, not dramatically but in that quiet, terrified way that happens when a person sees something they recognize but don't want to admit they understand. And when she finally looked up at me, she asked the one question I didn't want to answer. Why would Dad have this? I didn't know, and admitting that out loud made the room feel colder, because if the man in the photo was really Hale, and if my father met him after the disappearance, then everything we believed about the past, about our father, his work, his character, had been built on something that wasn't real, and that realization made my chest feel heavy in a way I couldn't explain. I reached for another envelope, one labeled with a name I had never heard, and inside it I found photocopies of bank transfers, timestamps, and a short note of my father's handwriting, something cryptic about debts that can't be cleared, and promises that were never mine to keep. And the more I read, the more I felt like each page was a piece of a puzzle my father never intended for us to solve while he was alive. The workshop door rattled suddenly, as if someone outside brushed against it, or maybe tried to handle, and both Anna and I froze, listening to the quiet that followed, because in that moment it felt as if someone had been watching us from the yard, waiting for something, and neither of us moved until the sound faded into the distance. I closed the envelope slowly, looked at my sister, and realized that for the first time in my life I didn't know if I could trust her, not because she had done anything wrong, but because the letter in the first envelope warned me not to trust anyone, not even family. And that single sentence started digging into my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. I picked up the photograph again and looked at it differently this time, not just at the faces, but at the background, at the details, at the faint reflection in the metal surface behind them. And when I finally understood what that reflection was, my pulse jumped in my throat so violently I had to grab the workbench just to steady myself. Because that reflection proved one thing. My father wasn't the only person in the room when that photo was taken. Someone else was there. Someone who knew exactly what was happening. Someone I recognized. And that realization was only the beginning. I kept staring at that reflection, trying to convince myself I was wrong, because the shape was blurry and the angle was poor. Yet the more I looked at it, the more certain I became that the outline of the shoulders, the tilt of the head, and even a faint, familiar posture belonged not to a stranger, but to someone who had been around my father long enough to know every corner of his life. Someone who should have never been in the same room with a man like Robert Hale. Anna asked me what I was seeing, but I didn't answer right away, partly because I didn't trust my own eyes yet, and partly because that line in my father's letter, "Don't trust anyone, not even family," repeated itself in my head with each second I held the photograph, turning every familiar face in my memory into something uncertain, something that could be hiding intentions I had never noticed. I walked the other side of the workshop where the light hit better, held the photo under the lamp, and this time I saw it clearly. In the reflection of a steel cabinet behind my father, and Hale stood the silhouette of a man with a thick jacket and slightly hunched shoulders, the exact way my father's mechanic friend, Lewis Carter, always stood when he talked. The same man who had shown up at the funeral with eyes that wouldn't meet mine and hands that shook when he placed a white flower on the coffin. I remembered how he avoided me that entire day, how he left early claiming he had work to finish, which made no sense because he retired 3 years ago, and now the realization that he was present in that room made my stomach twist sharply, because if he had been involved with Hale back then, and if he was still around now, then maybe he wasn't just avoiding me at the funeral, maybe he was waiting to see whether I would find something I wasn't supposed to. Before I could say anything, I heard a loud vibration coming from inside the box, a buzzing sound that made both Anna and me jump, and when I reached inside, I realized it wasn't coming from the envelopes, but from a small black USB drive that I hadn't noticed earlier, a device taped to the bottom corner, almost invisible unless you were looking for it intentionally. The buzzing stopped the moment I touched it, as if the motion sensor inside it reacted to contact, and the cold weight of it in my hand felt wrong. Because my father didn't understand this kind of technology, not at this level, which meant someone else had given it to him, or someone else had forced him to use it. I plugged it into an old laptop he kept on a high shelf, the one he used only for basic things like invoices and manuals. And once it powered up and the files appear on the screen, I felt the tension in the room grow thicker, because what loaded wasn't random data, but a hidden folder labeled only with a date, 3 weeks before his death. Inside that folder were several audio files, each one short and numbered. And when I clicked the first, my father's voice filled the workshop, shaky and breathless, telling someone that he couldn't keep doing this, that he didn't want Michael involved, and that hell needed to be stopped before more families got pulled into this mess. And hearing him speak those words made the back of my neck sting, because this wasn't the voice of a man who was planning to run or hide. This was the voice of a man preparing for something he didn't expect to survive. I played the second recording, and this time another voice answered, a deep, filtered tone that barely sounded human, telling my father that he owed too much to walk away, and that debts don't disappear just because a man grows old. And while the distortion made it impossible to fully identify the speaker, I had the awful feeling I'd heard that cadence before, maybe in the background conversations at the garage years ago, maybe in the voice of someone who had always acted too friendly, without ever giving anything of himself away. Anna grabbed my arm, her voice shaking as she asked if we should stop listening. But I couldn't stop, not now. Now with the truth finally opening up like a crack in a wall I had been leaning on my entire life. And when the third recording began, containing a sound that froze both of us in place, the sound of someone pounding on a door, followed by my father whispering, "He's here earlier than we agreed. I don't have much time." I felt sweat run down my back, despite the cold evening air in the workshop. The fourth recording started automatically. But I stopped it halfway, because the last thing my father said before his voice cut out was something that made my entire body go numb. If something happens to me, Michael will figure it out, but keep him away from Carter. He's working both sides. I turned slowly toward the workshop window, suddenly certain I'd seen something move outside, and for a split second I caught the faintest shadow slipping past the edge of the glass, moving quietly in the darkness like someone who already knew we were listening. And the worst part was, I had a sickening feeling I knew exactly who it was. I stood frozen for several seconds, staring at the dark window, trying to steady my breathing while my mind raced through every possible explanation. Yet the more I replayed the shadow's movement in my head, the more convinced I became that it wasn't random, because the slow, cautious way it slipped past the glass reminded me exactly of how Lewis Carter used to walk when he didn't want to disturb anyone. The same careful steps he took in my father's garage when he thought no one was watching. Him steal tools or pocket cash in the register decades ago. Small things we all brushed off back then, because he was like family, even though he clearly wasn't. Anna whispered my name, her voice trembling, and when I finally turned toward her, she was already backing away from the window, clutching the edge of the table as if she needed something solid to keep herself from breaking down. But the moment I told her we needed to leave the workshop immediately, she shook her head and insisted on staying, claiming we didn't even know who was outside, even though the fear in her eyes said she knew it just as well as I did. I shut the laptop, grabbed a USB drive, and shoved it into my pocket, because something inside me kept telling me that whoever was outside wasn't just checking on us, but was waiting for us to slip up, waiting for us to make the mistake of leaving evidence behind. And the idea of losing those recordings made the air in my lungs feel heavier with every passing second. We stepped out of the workshop into the cold evening air, moving quietly along the side of the house. And even though I tried to keep my steps silent, the gravel beneath my boots felt painfully loud, like each crunch announced our location to whoever was hiding in the shadows. When we reached the end of the yard, I finally looked toward the far fence, expecting to see someone ducking behind it, someone watching us. But there was nothing there, only darkness and a faint sound of wind pushing against the old wooden boards. And for a moment, I wondered if the shadow had been nothing more than paranoia fueled by the recordings, until I saw the footprint. A single, clear boot print in the dirt, fresh, deep, pointing directly toward the workshop door. I crouched down, my pulse hammering in my ears, and traced the edge of the print with my finger, feeling the cold impression of the tread, and the recognition hit me like a punch to the chest, because the pattern was identical to the boots Carter wore every day of his life, Heavy black work boots with a distinct diagonal line across the heel, a brand he bragged about buying because they last forever. And seeing that print in my father's yard made my skin crawl. Anna saw my reaction and immediately demanded I tell her what I'd found, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Not here. Not while night felt so close and so full of eyes. So instead, I told her we needed to get inside the house and talk where we could lock the doors and turn on all the lights, even though deep down I already knew a locked door meant nothing to a man who had been in my father's workshop at least once before. Inside the house, Mom was asleep on the couch, unaware of anything happening outside, and seeing her like that, peaceful, vulnerable, trusting, filled me with a sudden heaviness, because I realized this wasn't just about my father's past anymore, but about the safety of the people still alive, people who had no idea that the same man involved with a fugitive like Hale was now watching our family from the shadows. I led Anna into the kitchen, closed the door quietly behind us, and finally told her what I suspected about Carter, about the reflection in the photo, about the audio recordings hinting at betrayal from someone who worked both sides. And the moment the words left my mouth, her face went pale in a way I hadn't seen since we were children standing outside the hospital the night our grandfather died. She insisted we call the police, but I told her I couldn't trust them yet, not when my father had been involved in something deep enough to require hidden recordings and encrypted USB drives, not when the name Hale still carried weight with people whose loyalty was bought in cash rather than morality, and not when Carter had always seemed to know things he shouldn't, things only someone connected would know. Before we could argue further, my phone vibrated in my pocket, a single notification lighting up the screen, an unknown number sending a message that made the blood in my veins turn cold. "You're looking in the wrong place, Michael. Check the garage tomorrow. Come alone." Anna reached for the phone to read the message, but I pulled it back instinctively, because something about the timing, the wording, and the boldness of the text made me realize this wasn't just a threat. It was an invitation. And whoever sent it already knew I would show up. I barely slept that night, not because of fear in the usual sense, but because the message kept replaying in my thoughts with the same cold precision as the recordings from my father's USB drive, each word suggesting the sender knew far more about my movements, my habits, and even my emotional state than any normal person should. And by the time the first light came through the kitchen window, I already understood that refusing to go to the garage would only shift the danger toward the rest of my family, something I wasn't willing to risk. Anna tried to convince me to stay home, claiming we should wait and think it through, but every argument she gave sounded too slow for a situation that was clearly escalating hour by hour. So I told her I needed to handle it myself, and although she protested, the exhausted look in her eyes showed she also sensed that something irreversible had already been set in motion. I parked my truck a block away from the old garage where my father and Hale used to work, choosing a spot behind a delivery van to avoid being visible from the street, and as I approached the building on foot, I noticed how the surrounding area seemed unusually still for this hour of the morning, with the neighboring shops closed and the road empty in a way that felt engineered rather than accidental. The garage door was slightly ajar, just enough for someone to slip inside without making noise, and when I pushed it open wider, the hinges moved smoothly, which surprised me because nobody had maintained them for years, suggesting that someone had been entering this place recently and cared enough to ensure no sound revealed their presence. Inside, the air felt heavy, carrying the faint smell of chemicals mixed with dust, and the dim light filtering to the high windows revealed tools scattered across the floor, stacks of old tires leaning against a wall, and several metal cabinets pushed open, as if someone had been looking for something specific and didn't want to waste time putting anything back. I walked slowly toward my father's old workspace, the one bench he had always kept organized no matter how chaotic the rest of the garage became, and the sight of it now, drawers forced open, papers tossed on the ground, and a cracked coffee mug lying on its side, made it clear that whoever sent the message wanted me to see all this, wanted me to understand that the past wasn't buried, but waiting to be uncovered with every step I took deeper into this place. On the table lay a folder sealed with a strip of gray tape, and written across it in thick marker was a single word, Turner, which instantly tightened something in my chest, because Hale never used last names casually, and the idea that a file dedicated to my father or worse, to our family, made every instinct in my body sharpen. I opened the folder carefully and found a collection of documents that didn't make sense at first glance. Photocopies of contracts, lists of equipment, handwritten notes with initials instead of names, and several printed photos of men I recognized from the envelopes back in the workshop. Men who had vanished from their jobs, their towns, even their families, all within a short time frame. Tucked between two sheets was something that stopped me more than the rest, an invoice stamp with a date 3 days before my father died, showing a transaction from a company I had never heard of, a company that according to an online search didn't exist anywhere legally, and the amount transferred matched the exact number my father withdrew from his account the morning before he collapsed. My thoughts raced as I tried to understand why he would send money to an unregistered business. And the only explanation that fit the pattern was a possibility that he'd been paying someone off, either trying to protect us or trying to delay something he didn't want reaching us. And whichever was, the fact that the folder was left here for me to find meant someone wanted to make sure I understood how deep the story went. A soft metallic sound echoed from deeper inside the garage, the unmistakable scrape of a shoe against concrete, controlled and deliberate, and although I didn't turn immediately, I felt the weight of someone's presence waiting just beyond the rows of abandoned machinery, someone who had been listening long enough to know I was alone, exactly as instructed. I placed the folder into my jacket, straightened slowly, and finally looked toward the source of the noise, expecting Carter or someone from Hale's circle, but instead the silhouette that stepped into the weak light belonged to a person I had never seen before, a tall figure with a worn jacket and a face partially hidden under a hood, someone who stood with an unsettling stillness, as if observing me was their only task. They raised a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture that demanded silence, and spoke in a calm, low voice that felt practiced, almost rehearsed, telling me that information I needed, information my father died trying to protect, and that if I wanted the truth, the real truth, I had exactly one chance to walk out of here alive. And they ended with a sentence that struck harder than anything I had read in the folder. Your father wasn't the only one Hale was using, and he wasn't the last. The stranger's voice stayed in the air like a weight I couldn't shake off, and although every instinct in me wanted to demand answers right there in the middle of the garage, the way he kept his posture, steady, motionless, and almost unerringly composed, made it clear he wasn't someone who responded well to pressure. So I forced myself to stay still and listen, hoping he would reveal something without pushing this encounter into a direction I wasn't prepared for. He walked closer with slow, controlled steps, stopping several feet away from me, close enough for me to see the lines on his face and the tired expression in his eyes. And when he pulled the hood down, I realized he wasn't as young as I initially thought. Probably in his 40s, maybe older, the kind of age where a man has seen enough to stop trusting anything that moves too quickly toward him. He told me his name was Mark, although he admitted it wasn't the name he used when he worked around my father and Hale, and that detail alone sent a thin ripple of unease through my chest, because it meant he had been part of whatever group Hale controlled. And if he had walked away from them, he had done so at a cost I probably didn't want to imagine. He nodded toward the folder I'd hidden in my jacket and said my father had tried to get out weeks ago, but never made it beyond this building, because someone intercepted him, someone who reported back to Hale before my father even reached the street, and hearing that made my jaw tighten, because it confirmed what I'd been trying not to accept, that my father had been watched closely during his final days, and the person doing the watching had access to places he trusted. Mark told me Hale had a habit of forcing people into roles they never asked for, using debts, threats, or old mistakes as leverage, and that my father had been fighting to cut ties long after everyone else assumed Hale had vanished for good, which explained why my father became distant months before his death, spending long evenings in the workshop with the lights off, working in silence, refusing to answer questions even when we could see he was carrying something far heavier than age or illness. I asked Mark why he was here now, why he waited until after my father died to reveal himself, and although he didn't answer immediately, the hesitation in his voice when he finally spoke told me he'd been weighing the risks long before approaching me. Said he had hoped my father would find a way out, that maybe he'd managed to cut the rope Hale kept tightening around him, but when he learned my father collapsed, he realized the pressure had reached a point where retreat was no longer possible for anyone connected to him. He said something else, too, something that struck deeper than anything he had mentioned before, that every time my father tried to walk away, someone in our family reported his movements, passing information straight to Hale's people, and hearing that felt like a slow, cold wave rising inside my chest, because it meant the warning in my father's letter wasn't paranoia, but a fact he had lived with until the moment he died. I wanted to deny it, to push the idea away, but Mark didn't give me that luxury. He continued speaking with the same calm, steady voice, explaining that Hale preferred using people who already had access to private family matters, individuals who could blend into everyday life without drawing attention, the type of person who could visit a home, attend birthdays, offer help during hard times, and still pass information without raising suspicion. When I asked which member of my family had been involved, Mark didn't answer directly. Instead, he said that the person who betrayed my father had been doing it for years, not out of loyalty to Hale, but out of fear, and that fear had grown into something closer to survival instinct, making them cooperate far more willingly than anyone would expect if they heard the truth out loud. He told me there was one more folder hidden in the garage, something my father never managed to retrieve, and inside it I would find the first real confirmation of who had been feeding Hale information, a list of deliveries, dates, coded notes, and somewhere among them, a set of initials that would reveal the identity of the one person my father could never stop protecting, even when that protection was killing him slowly. He walked to the back of the garage, reached behind a stack of tires, and pulled out a flat metal box with chip paint, placing it on the table with a muted thud, then stepped back as if distancing himself from the fallout of whatever I was about to discover. I opened the box slowly, expecting financial records or another set of photographs, but instead I found a single envelope sealed with red tape, and inside it a list of transactions marked with the initials 8 key, repeated across multiple pages in a pattern too consistent to ignore. And the moment I saw those initials, I felt the air in my lungs turn heavy, because there was only one person in my family with those initials, someone who had been close to my father every day of his life, someone who had every opportunity to protect him but apparently chose something else instead. Anna Turner. For several long seconds, I just stared at the initials on the page, trying to force my mind to reject what my eyes were telling me. Yet the repetition of those 2 letters across every document left no room for misinterpretation, because there had only ever been one person in our family with those initials, and realizing that my sister had been communicating with Hale's people behind my father's back tightened something inside my chest in a way no physical threat ever could. Mark watched me carefully, his expression steady, almost prepared for the reaction I was having, and although he didn't speak immediately, the quiet acknowledgement in his eyes told me he had known this part would hit harder than the rest, which made me wonder just how long he'd been aware of my sister's involvement, and why he hadn't tried to warn my father before everything spiraled into something neither of us could undo. I asked him when my sister started talking to Hale's group, and instead of giving a direct answer, he explained that Hale never relied on people who had nothing to lose. He preferred those who were caught between bad decisions and worse consequences, individuals who had made one mistake too many and were desperate for a way to keep their lives from falling apart, which immediately made my thoughts drift back to the period 5 years ago when Anna suddenly settled a large debt without any explanation, insisting she had handled everything on her own. Mark told me that someone had approached her during that time offering a temporary solution, and once she accepted the offer, the arrangement quietly transformed into an obligation she could never escape, and though I wanted to believe she had been manipulated, the cold efficiency of the transactions in the envelope suggested she had not only cooperated, but maintained consistent communication with Hale's people for years. The idea of confronting her directly felt pointless. Any confrontation would only push her deeper into fear and secrecy, so I asked Mark what Hale wanted from her, and he explained that her role was simple. She provided updates about our father's schedule, his moods, any unusual behavior, and whether he had attempted to break away. Meaning every attempt my father made to protect us had likely been reported within hours to the very man he was trying to escape. I felt a heavy silence settle over the garage, not because I didn't believe what I was hearing, but because the pieces started forming a clear shape, showing me exactly how trapped my father had been. And as much as I wanted to blame Anna, I also understood how easily fear can twist a person into someone they never intended to become. Mark stepped close to the table and placed a small metal key next to the folder, saying it opened a locker in the city's old bus terminal, a place Hale's people rarely monitored anymore, and inside that locker I would find the last set of documents my father managed to hide before he collapsed, documents he intended me to see only when the truth became unavoidable. He warned me that once I took those files, Hale's circle would know I had crossed the point of no return, because the locker had been flagged weeks ago as a potential risk, and anyone accessing it would be marked as a target, meaning whatever time I had before would disappear the moment I walked into that terminal. I asked him why he was helping me, And he said my father had saved his life years ago during a situation he refused to describe, and this was the only debt he could still repay without dragging his own family into danger. But after this, he wouldn't be able to stand beside me again. When he walked toward the exit, he stopped once more and told me something that stayed with me long after he left the building, that my father's final days weren't marked by fear, but by determination, and if I wanted to finish what he started, I needed to be willing to see every piece of the truth, even the ones that would break whatever remained of my family. He disappeared into the daylight outside, leaving me alone with the folder, the key, and the knowledge that the next step would force me to face not just Hale's world, but the person inside my own house who had helped sustain it. And as I stood there gripping the key, I finally understood that there was no turning back from the path my father had left for me. I left the garage with the metal key pressed into my palm, walking back toward the truck with the kind of focused calm a person gets only when every hesitation has already been burned out of them, because the moment Mark told me the locker had been flagged, I understood that whatever lay inside it wasn't meant to survive long enough for anyone in my family to see, which meant I had to reach it before Hale's people realized the timeline had changed. The trip to the old bus terminal took less than 20 minutes, yet the drive felt longer, stretched by the way my mind kept circling around the same questions. How deep would my father have been involved? How far Anna had gone to protect herself? And whether Hale had anticipated I'd continue the search after my father's death, or whether this path was never meant for me at all, but for someone he believed he could bend as easily as he had bent so many others. The terminal looked exactly as I remember from years ago, a large concrete structure with peeling paint, half-broken lights flickering above glass doors that hadn't been replaced since the 90s, and inside a wide hall full of old benches and travelers passing through without looking at anything for too long. The kind of place where someone could hide in plain sight, simply by choosing the right corner. Locker row C was at the far end of the hall, next to a vending machine that buzzed like it had been dying for years, and as I approached the lockers, I scanned the faces around me, checking for anyone lingering too long or pretending to wait for a bus that wasn't scheduled, but everyone looked ordinary enough. Tired commuters, a man eating a sandwich, a woman scrolling through her phone. Nothing that screamed danger, although I'd learned by now that the most dangerous people rarely stood out. I found locker C, 47, inserted the key, and opened it slowly, half expecting inside to be empty. But instead there was a sealed cardboard box wrapped in brown tape with my father's handwriting on the top, the same handwriting I had seen in the envelopes, and seeing his name again felt like someone had reached through time and grabbed me by the collar, pulling me into a part of his life he had spent years trying to keep separate from ours. I lifted the box and closed the locker, heading back toward the exit with a careful pace. But just as I passed a row of benches, I sensed someone behind me adjust their steps to match my timing, a subtle shift in rhythm that didn't feel random, and though I didn't turn around immediately, the consistent pattern of the footsteps made it clear that I had drawn attention the moment I took that box from the locker. I walked outside into the open air, choosing a path that curved around the terminal instead of heading straight to the parking lot, hoping to break the follower's line of sight long enough to confirm whether I was imagining things or whether the threat had finally arrived in physical form. But when I stepped behind a delivery truck and glanced back to the side mirror, I saw exactly what I expected, a man in a dark jacket standing near the exit, scanning the crowd with a level of focus. That didn't belong to a casual traveler. He wasn't looking for a bus. He was looking for me. I didn't go back to the truck. Instead, I walked toward the side street, keeping my steps steady so I wouldn't give myself away. And after turning behind an alley wall, I finally opened the box, tearing the tape silently with the edge of the key, revealing a stack of notebooks, printed emails, and pages filled with diagrams and timelines, a map of Hale's entire operation, written in my father's hand with the kind of detail that could dismantle the entire network if placed in the right hands. At the bottom of the box was a smaller envelope, crumpled as if my father had sealed it in a hurry, and inside a note written in a rushed script, words pressed hard into the paper, as if he wasn't sure anyone would ever read them. If you're holding this, you know who betrayed me. Don't confront her yet. She's not working alone. The sudden clarity of that sentence hit harder than the previous revelations, because it meant Anna's involvement wasn't isolated or impulsive. Someone close to her, someone embedded deeper, had been directing her actions, and the idea that the betrayal extended past a single person forced me to reconsider every assumption I had made about who played what role in my father's downfall. I closed the envelope and looked back toward the terminal, Seeing the man in the dark jacket, walking with purpose now, heading toward the alley where I stood, and although fear wasn't the right word for what I felt, there was a sharp awareness settling under my ribs, the kind that comes when a person realizes he has moved from researching the past to stepping directly into its unfinished conflict. I grabbed the box, slipped into the narrow corridor between two buildings, and understood with blunt certainty that Hale had already noticed my presence on the board. And from this point on, every move I made would bring me closer to the truth, and closer to the people who would do anything to stop me from reaching it. I moved deeper into the narrow passage between the buildings, carrying the box tight against my side, hearing the steady rhythm of the man's footsteps closing the distance behind me. And although the alley was quiet enough for every small sound to stand out clearly, I kept my pace controlled to avoid giving him the satisfaction of seeing panic in my movements, because whatever he wanted, he expected me to run, and I wasn't going to follow the script Hale's people wrote for others. The alley turned sharply to the left, revealing a service road that fed into the backside of several abandoned shops, and I crossed it quickly, keeping to the blind spots created by dumpsters, broken vending machines, and old metal racks, each one giving me a few more seconds to think through the next steps, because now that I had the contents of the locker, I understood why Mark said the moment I opened that door the point of no return had already been crossed. I ducked behind a loading ramp and listened. The footsteps stopped near the mouth of the alley, replaced by the sound of someone adjusting their breathing, steadying themselves the way a man does when he prepares to follow a target into a tighter path. And as the quiet settled, I realized I wouldn't be able to shake him by running. Not today, not with his box in my hands. So instead of retreating, I decided to shift direction entirely and head toward a place where I could finally look at these documents without being hunted through public streets. I slipped out onto the next road, hailed a taxi before the man stepped into view, and slid into the back seat with a box on my lap, giving the driver an address far from my home, or any location my family would have expected me to choose, because I wanted to ensure that whoever followed me would be forced to keep their distance or risk drawing attention in a way Hale's operation couldn't afford. The driver didn't ask questions. He simply drove through a series of back roads that led to an older neighborhood near the edge of town, a place where small rental units sat behind rusted gates. And once we stopped in front of one of those aging buildings, I paid in cash and stepped inside the first-floor hallway, grateful that the complex still had enough vacancies that I could choose a unit without alerting anyone to my purpose. Inside the borrowed room, plain walls, dim light, furniture that had seen better decades, I opened the box again, spreading the documents across the table until the entire surface was covered with my father's handwriting, timelines, sketches of meeting places, and the names of individuals Hale had used to build a network that operated in the shadows of legitimate businesses, each page showing a level of precision and awareness I never imagined my father capable of documenting. At the center was a chart connecting people through arrows and notes, and seeing my sister's initials placed beside another set, Elsie Lewis Carter, felt like watching a map of betrayal unfold in slow motion, revealing that Anna had never acted alone, but had followed Carter's instructions under the illusion that he was helping her resolve her problems, when in fact he had been tightening Hale's hold on our family with every visit, every conversation, every quiet moment where he pretended to offer support. My father's handwriting circled their initials, with a short message written beside it. They don't know the full plan. Keep them separate. Keep them safe from Hale's endgame. Endgame. The word struck me with a clarity nothing else in that box had managed, because it suggested Hale wasn't simply maintaining a network, but building towards something more decisive, something that required removing my father once he refused to comply. And if that plan was still active, then Anna's involvement made her just as vulnerable as the rest of us, only she didn't realize it yet. I examined the next set of pages, addresses, coded dates, and one location marked with a thick red line across the margin, a place about 20 miles outside town near an abandoned storage site, and the note beside it read, "If anything happens to me, this is where he goes. He won't leave until everything is secured." I didn't need Mark to explain what that meant. My father had already given me the one place where Hale would eventually show himself, the place where everything could end if I chose to bring the confrontation there. Before I could pack the papers back in the box, my phone vibrated on the table, displaying a message from an unknown number, the same pattern as before, the same blunt tone that avoided threats and went straight to intention. "You want the truth? Come to the storage site tonight. Alone. Bring what you took." There was no signature, no threat, no attempt to hide the sender's confidence. Only the address of the same location circled in my father's notes, which meant Hale wasn't hiding anymore. He was waiting, and he expected me to come. I left the rented room long before sunset, taking only the box, my father's notes, and the quiet certainty that the confrontation waiting for me at the storage site would not resemble the dramatic endings people imagine when they talk about revenge, because nothing about this situation was cinematic or heroic. It was methodical, intimate, and built on years of damaged trust. And the only way to finish it was to follow the path my father had drawn long before he died. The road leading to the site cut through a stretch of empty land where warehouses once buzzed with workers, and as I approached the rusted gates, I could see the outlines of several abandoned buildings, each one hollowed out by time and weather, leaving behind structures that echoed the same quiet decay that had crept into my family long before I realized it. My headlights swept across the cracked asphalt, illuminating a single figure standing near one of the larger storage halls, tall, composed, and still enough to send a cold clarity through my chest, because there was no mistaking the posture of a man who controlled a network for decades without raising his voice, a man whose presence didn't rely on intimidation, but on certainty. Hale stood there like he had been expecting me for years. No mask, no attempt to hide, no fear of the consequences that were finally catching up to him. I stepped out of the truck, box in hand, and the distance between us fell heavy with every unanswered question my father's documents had raised. Yet Hale didn't speak until I was close enough to hear him breathe, and even then his voice came out calm, measured, almost disappointed, as if I had arrived too late to understand what he believed I should have learned long before my father died. He said my father had been useful until he wasn't, that old loyalties meant nothing once a man refused to cooperate, and that removing him had been an unfortunate but necessary step. A sentence spoken with such casual indifference that for a moment I felt something inside me shift from anger into a far colder state, the kind where emotion no longer guides action, only purpose does. I told him I had everything, the documents, the recordings, the names, the old meeting logs, and Hale nodded slowly, not in fear but in recognition, as if he had known that eventually someone would gather pieces and walk directly into the heart of his operation. And instead of denying anything, he asked whether I truly understood what my father had been trying to prevent, a question designed not to reveal truth, but to destabilize it. When I didn't answer, he stepped closer, explaining that men like him never disappear as long as there are people willing to trade their loyalty for survival, and that removing one man, even someone like him, would barely dent the machinery behind him, a machinery built from desperation, mistakes, and people who believed they had no other path forward. But then he made the mistake of mentioning Anna. He said she had been predictable, easily influenced, and ultimately irrelevant, a tool he no longer needed now that I had surfaced of the files, and hearing him frame her as disposable stripped the last thread of restraint from whatever restraint I had been clinging to. I opened the box slowly, not because I needed the papers, but because Hale needed to believe that was my intention, and when his eyes shifted toward the documents, the slight break in his focus gave me the one opportunity one had been waiting for since the moment I stepped out of the truck. I pulled the compact recording device from my pocket, the same one my father used, and pressed the activation switch that triggered the beacon mark had slipped into my jacket before he left, the one that alerted a group of people Hale had betrayed long before he ever set eyes on my family, men whose lives he had dismantled just as methodically as he dismantled my father's. Hale turned sharply, realizing too late that this meeting was no longer between the two of us, and within seconds the sound of engines cut through the open yard, headlights revealing several vehicles closing in from both sides of property, each one carrying individuals whose names appeared on the very pages my father risked everything to collect. Hale stepped back, calculating, searching for a way out, but the circle tightened quickly, efficiently, and when he finally looked at me, the calmness in his eyes had been replaced with something closer to recognition, the understanding that the same system he built had finally turned on him. He opened his mouth to speak, maybe to negotiate, maybe to justify, but the chance for that passed long before tonight. And as the men he once used stepped forward to take him, I closed the box, turned away, and walked back toward the truck with the simple, unshakable knowledge that my father's unfinished work had been completed exactly where he intended it to end. By the time I reached the gate, the engines had grown distant, leaving the night quiet again, and I allowed myself one final breath of air before closing the chapter he began, knowing there was nothing more to uncover, Nothing more to chase, nothing left to fear. The story ended exactly where it needed to, and everything after belonged to silence.